Oh yeah, oh that is it. Oh yeah, I'm not this carrying go. No, they are church band the other shelf on the oh, to know. Rangu talk about Tongaki is Rangu talk about Tongaki, can she send it to me? Young da Seba couldn't keep it in the choy and also. Oh, to say from Batara. Tanga to Cassie Kibuchung the Gina. Chuggy Tambo Yashungangi Kansachina. And a Tambo Shimjan Shanlia Savachena Tigmare some Savachena Tunge Yungure some Tunge on the Jigmare some Shangy Sochi Soba Savachena Shala Tunge Yungure Timbe some Shala Savapa Dunga use from Jacone Savapa Sini Yeni Chimbatan Sabala Soba Comne Joachima Hada Mi Quaban Stopna Asam Yawa Yeda Tundula Soba Kimbe Guba Tendage Samlu Chitone and then make you a chupa, Kiwa Chuba Chute Trubadoa. Takibu Dringi Kapsutele Loya Gacherchen. Loa. Oh, Takiwa Chima Sadami Quaban Tomna Negab Remato Sadamila Tunge Mabuyode. And then let them Yamo be showered the Jurchinje, young Kawachimania Sole Geshe Bare. Tayende, let them Yamo be one Sadamina Ida Tondo Kawayina, give me good by Chegusam. Koala, Rala Rawambe by Kichi Chekoba. Tell it ten to Tarwachi, and I would air some teacher go there some che. And a koala tando Sadami, Tawatia. Negap church to be ten some mato. Ko ten to Tawachi do something, Tarba to be shadow. And Tamebata, Metabata, Tameba, and Chagdang Samlo. Simjalina Ganzo, Conzo said Chagdang Samlo, or Tendrepan shadow. So I did keep on drinking this one. I'll teach you on my Duchimat.
Yeah. So here, as for what to begin with, to start with a verse from the great Pandita Atisha, he says that those who, through their personal suffering, truly want to end completely all the suffering of others are persons of supreme capacity. So we had seen before, in the verses prior to this, that for a being of a small scope or a smaller capacity, one who's first entering into practice, they are thinking that, well, I need to abandon harming other sentient beings because this is going to bring about suffering. Suffering for other sentient beings that I create through my harm is going to generate further suffering. And so due to that kind of contemplation, they avoid any kind of non-virtues, avoid killing, and so forth, abandon the 10 non-virtues, and engage in positive practices like generosity and ethics, and so forth, in order to secure a good rebirth as a human or a god, in order to not be born in the lower realms, as say a hell being or a hungry ghost. Contemplating those kinds of suffering, they abandon non-virtuous actions and engage in virtue for that kind of purpose. And then expanding the sort of goal, making it more expansive, one gets to the being of middling capacity, who recognizes that, well, even if one is born as a human or a god, one experiences all the sufferings of cyclic existence. From the moment of being born, one is subjected to the various types of sufferings, and this is because one is born due to the force of karma and the afflictions. And so recognizing that all of the kinds of existences one can take within this cycle are still in the nature of suffering, and that none of them is really a free kind of existence, one wishes to be freed from that kind of cycle of taking rebirth due to karma and the afflictions. And so recognizing that a rebirth as a human or a god is not really the ultimate goal, but is merely a temporary kind of state in which one can practice. The real kind of a goal that one is striving for is liberation from all of this, liberation from the cycle of existence. So recognizing the kind of fault of attachment and aversion and so forth.
Oh yeah, right? Just keep on drinking capsule, then it chuck down simply a taxo than sensuous, chose shorty, carry some of the chita, we will kind of chuck down the 대왕gel랭에 버산에 코아 코르도 삼네 니 착단데 매버서 우여라 착단데 매버서에 전달이야 신디 깨지 집에 미다바치 삼을 땅도 가리나 땡도 땡겐데 없이 삼을 땅도 에네 배 대와주베데 게 첨부시버시 지기 어떤 소스 대인도 깨지 집에 미다바 신디 연도 미네바 미다바다 에네 땅진기 왕게 착단만 붙이고 그러라 이해를 무시하고 땡겐이 삼사 제제 들립니다 보삼 당겨라 되네시니 착단기에 쪼드 가르스나 다도 짐바세 유 랑원에 주바 짐바스라 나세 랑원에 주투바지 에네 셴스도 랑원에 주바지 대왕게 이도와 자이나자 녀이나자 마이게 차셰만 붙일 소수 삼르파 소유샵 멤버자 코란 안에서 지투되게서 유진원에서 마 제라 자인다 생각하지 나 제라니다 생각해 유 코란게 뭐나 라왕게 랑신지 수투되버리 삼을 거고라 될 때는 차단 연구 되는데 차단 매버서야리야 아니 이동아 이나자 이동명아 이나자 다 이나자 남중한 주 삼대하게 라와 주반진바 티나시요 마레서 삼을 건데 아니 동바수도 시다 주고 주서매봐 남중한 주 삼대가 서라와도 소주에 삼을 당기라 자스도 이동아 명화스도 시버지 라와도 어때한데 그면도 소소샘 그바 딱바를 치레도 삼상게 삼을 건에 차단 용도가라 대대 기본 전기값소 심제 채매발하면 대화다 다긴 간주 심제레레레야 다와다 트렌드 동에 트렌드 그 심기부 총급값이어라 대가로 채로를 다 심제 채매발이야 다와다 트렌드다 동에다 트렌드 삼로게 아니 다음에 받아 미닥발 쏘고 어디 공부여라 탈바토에 했던다 뒤지 som나
So then the being of middling capacity, again, they begin to sort of expand their mindset, seeing the defects of attachment and aversion, because it is due to these kinds of states of attachment and aversion that we then accumulate karma that propels us in this cycle of existence. And so while we sort of want there to be a stable, lasting kind of happiness, the things that we are grasping at are actually temporary, are momentary. They're in this kind of momentary impermanence, meaning that they don't last for even a moment. We grasp at things as though they had some kind of permanence. We think that our life will sort of remain forever, but in reality, they don't have that sort of permanence. So in this way, the being of middling capacity begins to investigate things like impermanence in order to get rid of that grasping at things as permanent, as well as investigating and examining the way that we hold things to exist from their own side. So when we are, say, seeing something that we find attractive, or even the kind of sense of I that we have this thought of I or me that is set up from its own side, that isn't dependent upon anything else. And it's so too with the things that we take as objects. Like when we see something we think is attractive, we think it's that way from its own side. Or when we see an enemy, we think they're really that from their own side without being dependent upon anything else. So we hold things in this way, like, oh, that's my friend because they really truly exist like that, or that's my enemy because they are really truly existent in that way. And so in order to get rid of that, in order to get rid of this way that we hold there to be some sort of autonomous self, this gets into the kind of description or our understanding of emptiness, in that when we look for such a really truly existent self that's set up from its own side, there's nothing that we can find to point us to that really exists in that way. And so this kind of investigation leads us to understand that it is on this basis that countless sentient beings, we all wish to have happiness and we all wish to avoid suffering, as was realized for the being of small scope. But when we get to the being of middling capacity, we see that these beings are suffering due to this kind of misperception. And it's that sort of grasping at things as having existence from their own side that needs to be overcome. And so this is the kind of realization of a being of middling capacity.
Oh yeah, 기분 되게 소소 kowe tongele tarbadi tso chigdwa. Rang kowe tongele tarna asam ti tso che. Ti mato rang na shin shen tongel nyangde yore sam shen rangi pama nyandele sokwa tezo rang da chigwa tongel nyang yore ti tarba chego samza samlo ti ke tog madwa. Oh, ti che ta kibu chenpyo kapso. Oh, teni rangyu tokbe tongel ki se. Kibu chenpo teke takin kibu chungu tan jingi samlo tanya tozo kanga yunden de yardengi chuji yorwa, yaje chini yorwa. Oh, ti yende ka soda. Rang tongel ki nani koa le tarwa cheko to sam. Oh, ti nashi rang cheko koa le tarwa samlo tanya jiga me do sam. Rangi chindi pama nye nye dula sokba. Oh, tezo changma tongel ko na ko jawa koa le tongel nyangda nyangchu rang cheko di koa le tar kudu samna marab re sam. Ti rungi ma re sam roa. Rangi pama tinje tezo changma randan rawa koe tongel jawa thoma meba ne chenge susumla kene rawa meba tongel nyang tanda mao bana do se tongel nyang chi deya telia samlu matambo sosu chikbu tarna samsa samlu tana te marab re samne roa. Ane simje tamje chende rangi pama nye dule sokwa so chene tongel da tezo ya tongel da trawa chikbu do sam roa. Chende sa mare simje shenda kyawal thongma yo marzo nangbe lu chena kyawa ngama soso samlo tana be trang me chubare kyawa ngama minte chike na pama ta nye tula sokwa kari ne yang yordo te ngama chidu simjen di pama ta rangla tin chenpo chen di maje se yo mare simjen tamje nye du majuba chen di pama nye du kadro kandisi yu na te nangshin majuba simjen yo mare sam roa. O te yendu simjen tamje tongel de trawa chako gure samsange samlo kogdwa ene ranchi bu samlo tane jigmare sam takbe shenche ba se so tanja samlo tane de to thoma me bane ranchi bu ra ke sheshe ene ran kange se de ke sheshe ran tawa to ke sheshe ne tanda bado ane ke tongel tamje de trawa tamje damba ke choyo ma to o ti nore de sam sosu ke che ni shen tongju che de ni rangi tanda rangi kange se da tewa toya tanda shen la chawa che bala soba yungu to o ti me do sam nor sha sam ta sam lo tanda kora pe chebu ja yor no takshen chewa ase ata thoma me bane rang che ban jin bana she simje she che ban che thoma me bane rang yawar simje she yawar do na she rang shen ji tan do ko ma to rang de so me che shen de so che tak be shen ji be cha ju sim ke go do simje tamje tong de tawar cha samja ta simje tamje tong de tawar cha de chaye ge ne ba ko ba ta da rang ne ba yo ma re ta de simje tamje pa shan rang tong tamje le tawar ne ba yo ma re ti de ta nge lo cha ne 심지어 탐제 동에도 제 토버치에 규진의 상고로 저 란당보 꽤끔세 연대 군대 그러면 잠반이 이제 자와로서 탑 상부 탈신 랑도르진네 탐제 셰바 탈신 랑이 빵도 탈신 봐 꽤강가세 연대 탐제 랑도르진네 탐제 켄게 탐제 켄바 된대지 유로 지긴 있음 뭐니 년 타고네 대양한 존나 시삼로 천대 장장마도 tene me ronke de samta yu amara se de chone kyo de ro so che du war ma to sem de te ro samlu kyo de gra o te de be kyo ka je be ko na be ne sem je tamje ge to tup ge ka sa ji chi ge sam kyo na re ne be se tab shi she yun de re ne to be tab shi she ne sem je tamje ge to do kyo ma bu be ne sa je ko ba to ba che ge sam kyo ko se yun de ko de ki bu shi che ge sam 대전안에 심지어 탐제가 단다 주발은 누가 토바메 봐 연구하도 된데 삼로 거야 들이야 기부 첨부시거라 강시 랑 동네 그러와 되니까서 어디 세버군에 기부되니 초연어서도 라디오 떡배 동네기 강시 생기 동네 그 양다 세버군에 더 현다 동네데 세번도 봐 자원도 봐 간시 장기 떡배 동네 소설 뺄라나 소설 양반나시 현다가 양게 오래 삼내로 Rangi Dogbe Tungi, Kanshi Tunga, Yanda Seba Kunandi, Kibu Deni Choi, no, so Kibu Chamber Samlutulia, Tendisukudua, or Tijikun, Yamamusima.
So here, then, being of middling capacity is mainly contemplating their own suffering, wishing to be freed from this cycle of existence based upon their own suffering. But here, they're not really thinking about all of those other sentient beings, those beings that have existed as their mothers and fathers, friends and relatives and so forth. And so here, as we see in the kind of state of mind of a being of great capacity, is that those who suffering and truly want to end completely all the suffering of others are persons of supreme capacity. So being a supreme being is sort of like taken the base of these thoughts of the being of small and middling capacity and improve those understandings in order to get to a point where they see, it's really not okay to just think of my own suffering alone, but all sentient beings have acted as parents, as friends, as those that are close to me, loved ones of mine. And so it's not suitable for me to think just of my own suffering and want my own freedom, but rather these other sentient beings are experiencing all of these same kinds of suffering. And so I need to free them as well. To only think about my own suffering while they are suffering as well is a very base kind of a thought. It's a very sort of unsuitable sort of a thought. So here, this kind of attitude of a being of great capacity recognizes that there have been countless lives. We have gone through countless lives, and we can't therefore point to any being whom we have not been close to, who we have not had a kind of relationship of being a loved one to us. And so in this way, we recognize that all of these sentient beings are just like me. Based upon our own experience of suffering, we extrapolate that experience to others and wish to free them as well. Now, we have, through countless rebirths, thought only of ourself, really held ourself as most important, thinking, well, I need to accomplish my aims, and sort of looked down upon others. And in that way, we've harmed others to get what we want and done things that have accumulated activities trying to get our own aims. But really, what we need to do is recognize that we need to exchange that self and other in terms of exchanging our kind of self-cherishing attitude and instead cherish others. And whereas we normally kind of cast aside the needs of others, recognize that working for the needs of others is actually what we want to accomplish. And so now when we make this kind of recognition that others suffer just as we do, and there's a desire, a wish to free them all from their suffering, we get to a point where we realize that, well, at the current time, I don't have the ability to actually benefit these other sentient beings. But by training all my mind, by actually over time developing qualities through lifetime after lifetime, I can reach a state in which I have removed all faults and developed all qualities of love and compassion and knowledge and so forth, knowing to the perfection what is to be adopted and what is to be abandoned, and reach that state of omniscience in which I'm really truly able to benefit other sentient beings. So in this way, we should make a kind of resolution that lifetime after lifetime, we're going to make effort toward this goal of attaining Buddhahood. And then, once one has attained that kind of state in which all faults have been removed and all good qualities fully developed, then one will have the ability to benefit and help other sentient beings. So again, as Atisha's Lamp for the Path states, that those who, through their own personal suffering, so based upon our own experience of suffering, then truly want to end completely all sufferings of others, are persons of supreme capacity. So those who sort of take on this mission to free and liberate others based upon their knowledge of their own suffering, this is the attitude of a being of supreme capacity.
Oh yeah, that and that Tibetan kapsina rang the kitchenbo, rancho the kitchenbo, Zigdua.
We don't have any sound from Geshe to Thabkhe.
Oh, that Tibetan kapso, rang kitchenbo, rang nangmi kitchenbo, rang lungba kitchenbo, all this you hold on. teaching at the Bura. Yina Rang da Rangcho, Sosu da Sosu Kimja Sosu Garsura, Jacob Lungba Kari Hinaya, or the Geshe, the Kangesea, the what to education, but education Butsigiwara, Sina Chiguara. Yinaya, Sosu da Sosu Namita Sosu Chiso, the Kangesea, the what to Tondalia, Shala Chawachana Digmares. Shala Chawachi me some Sharana she tawandola tongue medibe some local yard no. She shall never take me some the artist some luti chene and it's to Budwa, Chotambutiretoa. Tai Kibun Dingy Capso. Oh, Tene Rancho, Sosu Lumba, Sosu, Mede Sosu Nami, Tikanya some time, some Lusunjo de some, Jachunjo de some Roa. Oh, they do some dark sauce. Rangi Nami, Rangi Cho, Rangi Lungba, Rangi Jago, Rangi Miri Serva, Cho Chiche, Shandaji Cho Chiche, telling Yering Samlutaya de Yagumarism, Chagda Meba, Semja, Daksho, and Shanjo, the Semja Lia, Keba Machi, Chibatagua, Chagda Meba Sugda, Kibu Drinky Cups, this over the Sigdua. Yina Kibu Drinky Cups. Ranchin in the Sochiora, Sosa Chepans and the Ranchum Batok Ticha Mato, Rale Kesho Chituyomara. Takibu Chamber Capso, Taksho de Shanjo Chatan Meba Samji Digio Maresua. Oh, Tita Simjan Samatamje, Taksho Shanjo Mebachene, Rale Shanchepans in Gurese. Toma Mebana Ranke Chishuchin, Kenya Yungior, Tatan the Shanke Chishu, some Lokoran Yuatangure. Tada Shank some Chebajaguris, Tashan Chewa Sigdwa. Oh, Tisa, Tagbe Shanche Bachene, Rale Shanla Bachegurese, oh, Tikibuchambu Samlo Kogdwa, oh, Tale Shanche Bazimbekone. Many Shanky Tandaliate, Kankuse, Yundem Kunde Kibu Keba Mambula, Sonam de Shigit Solasayag, Sosan Baby Chet Yungdwa. Oh, Tisa, oh, Kibuchambu Samlo. Simje Tamje get to and Saja Yukova, Rankin Kunse, Yunde Kunde, Kibu Simje Tamje get to Troop Tunge, Neba Yunge, the Troop Devana, Troop Eugene Sange, Sawa General, Shay Yavacho, Sangbo Tarsimba, Landor Tarsimba, Saja Yukova, the Tobacha, some Tikibuchambudua. Oh, Narajo, Tate, Saja Yukova, China, Tobacha. Ning Takbone Taja, and does Toba Chao Tendisha, you Maratini, Nubachimbutu Mara, never the Toba Chicken Samgura. Joan de Janja Mara, Joan and Joa Chirum, the Chirum, the Shirley Changbache, Tanju Militon Pans, some Taguara, what they do get Tatu Nevado. Simja Tamjag to Troop Tungi. Sambutan tapped and Shirum Niga Tarchimba, Roa. Ya Sambutan Shay Niga Tarchimba. Simja Tamjag Troop Tungi, meet Gaman, Lando Tamja Shangan, Chigi some. Or Tit and Dalia, I need to Jiggy Chede, Tanda Tandanga, the General Sobanation, Tobache, Sambache, Yana combat against some Tit and Dalia Children against some Guno set them December shoes out into the.
So, in the kind of mind of a being of small capacity, they hold their self as important. Their self, their family, their community, their country, they're sort of based upon that idea of self and other. They're really, they hold as more important, eliminating the sufferings of those that are considered on their side or or a part of their family or their country and so forth. But in service of accomplishing their own aims, they recognize that they can't hurt others because others are just like me and that they don't want to suffer and they want to have happiness. And so they go about practicing or accomplishing the aims of the ones that they consider to be on their side in a way that doesn't harm others. This is the sort of motivation of a being of lowest capacity. and a being of middling capacity, they think, well, it's not okay to think just about my country or my family, my area, and so forth, that's sort of a partial and a biased kind of attitude. We actually need to get rid of this thought of my side and the other side and see all others without any kind of attachment or aversion. Now, the being of middling capacity is not yet able to value others more than they value themselves, but they have gotten rid of this attitude of my side and other side. And so in that way, they have eliminated that kind of partiality, attachment toward some and aversion toward others. But at the level of a being of supreme capacity, just getting rid of that sense of my side and other side is not sufficient for them, but rather it's crucial to see others as more important, to actually exchange our self-cherishing attitude for an attitude that cherishes others, and work for the sake of others, to make this kind of commitment that one is going to put in effort to accumulate merit over countless eons in order to attain the state of Buddhahood, where one has eliminated all faults, gained all good qualities, and has the ability to actually benefit other beings by having perfected the sort of objects of knowledge, what is to be adopted, what is to be abandoned, and so forth. And so this kind of motivation, thinking that by whatever means I'm going to accomplish this state of Buddhahood, and not just in one lifetime, but through life after life. And we have to really have this kind of sincere and definitive sort of attitude. It's not like a wishy-washy, oh yeah, I sort of want to do this, but really think about this and set this kind of intention that is long-lasting and long-term, thinking that I'm going to continue to practice lifetime after lifetime, taking this Dharma, which is to be accomplished, in order to attain this state of Buddhahood that has eliminated all faults and perfected all good qualities. And so here, the Dharma that we are looking at is this text of Kamalashila, the stages of meditation. And so we should undertake these teachings with a sort of motivation that I'm going to hear these teachings, I'm going to reflect on them and meditate on them in order to attain that state of Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings.
Oh yeah, 당아주 대lep대와 그래서 현장대 그래서 시차를 가지고 능지 첨부해서 심지어 탐지 돈도 산계적 고바 중간이나 짜와짜와데 가려서 다 능지 첨부해 시쇼래서 심지어 탐지를 아니리매봐 당분간주 소소 파마년제 낭밀을 짜와시여라 소소를 짜와여라 대장제 멤버즈 낭밀을 짜와 대장제 멤버즈 자체로 제체로다는 심지어 탐지리아 잠바당 짜와 공고를 송겨라 대난에 당부 심지어 탐지 동에도 전도지 짜와데 개체쇼래서 대소소 락발을 여배 여배이나 네 산계의 연대 타르견군세 연대군대기 기부대 소소 락발의 여배다 직발을 송고도 저자 닝지 전부도 여나 닝지 전부 여나 신 심지어 탐지 동에다 자와는데 별로 좀 많이 봐시 여나 로속 전부 여나 동에다 탑 가르치고도 삼 탑대 산계의 고반 탑고래 삼 아니 산계 고반 탑대로 연구하노 동에다 전도 열로도 여배이나 아니 동에다 자와르시베 네바 전지 차고로 소소 네바요로 소소 네바요나 라견 것에 연대 군대 랑도진에 탐제 생겨지 자고 그래서 산계지 고반 톰도 치고요도 어디인데 닝지 전부도 연안에 산계 개발 장면 만보 초사 로 봐도 손남지 초사 다른 거 봐도 산계 강가 연구하러 와 어디인데 장고 닝지 전부도 연안 닝지 전부도 랑된 초지 자와대서 로서 랑데 초지 자와서 가르쳐서 심지어 탐제 동에도 전도 줄로치요나 대 동에도 제베 탑시 제고다 동에도 제 통근데 가른도서나 소소교군세 연대군대서로 당부 소소 심지어는 일이 매게 상부에 찍고 당게 애니 심지어 대조는 쭉 통근게 랑도르네 생겨서로 텔라 빵바 타도도 떡바 타도서도 빵도 타도니더라 소소교 탐제 파빵세 아니 연대랑도르네 탐제 시에서네 아니 생기때 동에도 저와 제토그와 대만에 동에도 저와서 뭐람 잡아 삼종그마도 제토에 내가 연구 말도 어때인데 니지 첨부데 랑데 체지 자와래 랑데 빵도 타르심보다 탐제 킴바 그 삼로 코야데 드네 코겨라 Sentungeda Travachaku, some Tichena, Tavshikar chicken bassin, Taraj Teto Chengenge, Kenkuse, and Dekundengi, Kiwich and Durachego, some Lukoyora. So round the Chugits our terrace. Shendu Chugits our terrace, Yinjichamboyana. Take my member, Rajumban, Church, around Tarbatosona, around Shiva English Shone. Some judge to Jacham Majaba Shiva English shoot and get the Richard Marichera. Musician Radunge the train, I said, Dunge the driver, Tapsi Sigramado. Ranko Dungele Tarwa, something young Dengon to Chigmare. Minebe young Dengon to Chigre. Koe Dungele Tawats and Mahimba. Shije Triba Pamba Pamba, Tribaniga, Nyomombe Tribata, Mishibe Momba Seve, Triba Pamba, Pamba Niga to Chigra. Take my member, you know, Ranko Dungele Tarba, Zambi Shiva, to Chigurno. Was a Shiva English Sugumares, Shangy Tanto with it. Shiva English Mashuba, that dinner disondor, Shiva English Sugar, take my member Nashira, Tarba Tom the Dang, so is the Tomney. Joa Toma and let the Yamabong Kogo, that the man gets out some best Tarbe, there was a that and the Dawarizera. That is on some Shiva English Sugar Mares. The Sajus and Barati. Shansim Jengi turned to Gresson. Shivayan Latin Yabashun, the Samjay term, Majaba Shukbade, Kamba member, Gamabu Signalia, Suyan, Rodiumardo, or dinner, she said, you are Richard, Chanju Sambake. Samjay term, Major Raji Buteade, Kamba member, Naloria, Missuyan, Shuk de Gumaratina, she Chanju Sambatele, Shuk de Gumares. Or the Loba Lambinega, so Shandon to the Chigitawa Ninjiri. Tarsangi Jokoban Topsona, Ransan Getsane, Shangi Tensone, Shala Chilson, Simjay Sony Chilson at the Nijichambu Yoda Yongorto. Nijichambu de Toma Getso, Pado Getso, Tamar Getso, Jebu Mimba than Rason Gudua. Sanjay Koban Topsason, that Jebu Mimba Nasher, Tatil, Sanjay Yamyon Zeba Saman Azul Mason and Azul Lonche Yora. Or do Case Chinside that that's all tenderity. Musician gets issued a Istanbul. Telebana and his Sanjay and that someone so like what she was a chibares. Take on don't you get our race and don't you get our teaching side. Tanganzo and then Kamalashila, Tangum comes at the last one. Oh, did you so not thought my document?
So here, as for where we had arrived in the text, we had come to the point of developing equanimity. So last we had gone through the importance of compassion. And so here, having this kind of compassion that is not a sort of biased compassion, like our ordinary kind of beings, we have compassion, the wish to free from suffering, those that are close to us or those that we consider to be friends and family. But we need to gain a kind of compassion that is impartial, that is without any sort of sense of attachment to some aversion for others. And so here, this is under the heading of the compassion section, but we'll be picking up from developing equanimity. So here, it's described that if you have this first root of compassion, it's as if you have Buddhahood in the palm of your hand. If you really have this unfabricated attitude of compassion, of wishing to free others from their suffering in a sincere and heartfelt kind of way, this is the root that leads to the fruit of Buddhahood. So if one develops this kind of attitude, this sincere desire to free others from their suffering, then naturally one will want to pursue gaining a state where you're able to free others from their suffering. And this is where the desire to attain Buddhahood comes in. So Buddhas, based upon their accumulation of merit for eons, have developed the ability to benefit others completely. And so here, to attain that kind of state of Buddhahood is to have developed all of one's own good qualities. So here, we need to understand that compassion is both the root of one's own aims, developing one's own aims, as well as the aims of others. So here, here, when we want to be able, the sort of state that one attains, the state of Buddhahood, is a state in which one has removed all fault and gained all good qualities, has brought one's realizations to completion, and has eliminated and has also perfected or completed the elimination. And so when we have this sort of state, we have accomplished all of our own aims. And so this is the way in which we are able to develop those, is because we have this desire to attain a state where we're able to benefit others, where we know all of the points of what is to be adopted and abandoned, and we want to become a being with the ability to benefit others. Thus, this compassion acts as the root of gaining our own aims, comprised of the realizations and eliminations that characterize one's own enlightenment. And it's also the root of benefit to others. Our benefit to others starts through this root of compassion. If one is only concerned with one's own suffering, then one could follow the path of a Hir or Shravaka or a Pratyeka Buddha and attain that kind of arhatship, wherein one will remain within a state of peace and not have any desire to make effort at benefiting other sentient beings. But a fully enlightened Buddha is able to fully benefit others because they're not remaining within that state of a kind of peace. They haven't attained that sort of nirvana in which they're just going to be experiencing the bliss of nirvana without benefiting others, but rather they attain what we call a non or abiding nirvana, which is the removal of both of the obscurations to omniscience and the afflictive obscurations. And when they have eliminated all of those kinds of obstructions, they are able to then be of benefit to others. And so bodhisattvas, those who are in training, actually view the kind of peace of nirvana as being like a burning house. That's something they don't want to go into. This is something that a Buddha would avoid at all costs. Rather, they want to remain in order to benefit other sentient beings. So compassion then is the root. It's important at the beginning for our giving rise to this desire to attain Buddhahood. It's important in the middle while we are training. And it's also described as like the ripening result of Buddhahood. The Buddha's actions that pervade everywhere are the result of this seed, this root of compassion. And so this compassion is important at the beginning, the middle, and the end. And if we make a great effort at compassion, then it's like we have Buddhahood in the palm of our hand. We have the very seed that will lead to that great result. So here, then we'll pick up from the way to meditate on compassion will be taught from the outset.
Well, yeah. 당한저디 닝지 첨부 공부들이야 전전 신대지 시도아. 전전 시고네야 공부거래서. 디나네 당부도 가르스네. 당부들 당령지 시주바 시도아. 당부다 심지 강가를 심령바 주고래서 거라. 가르스네 당부간주 대화다 트렌드다 동해다 트렌드의 소수집불도와 라 야부초나 좀 두고 마주나 좀 라를 잠지듯 개시실지 당분에 요라 라를 잠지 요래 랑 남을 잠지 요래 아니 랑 롱벌 잠지 요래 가리네 잠지 요래 잠지 요사 동해다 트레나 사태와 톰나 삼주는 배주 지그라 사야 통해 거래 내가 제판도 촌도 깔래 잡고도 팀매는 요야 마서 다시 되는데 당부 소소리 잠지 여버티 매나 소소 잠지 매나 고조 자 말네 강에 여버티 삼로마다나 강에 대세 삼로 고 말와 대화대가 탑고도 삼배 삼로도 매나 대화도 탑시 지금 말와 되는데 라라 잠지 여버티 라 첸디 만달에 첸디 동에도 첸디 대화도에 탑시 지기도 와 디나시 되니 지소이나다 낭미나다 강가 자체로 체르스탄 대수 강가 리스 초리 전기 잠지라 초리 전기 잠지도 여고라 디 시들에 야게나 시데 남배 처리야 시래 소소 삼래야 여여배 연대시 야야게 당기 와르노 대야르 당고라다 뭐티 인도 잠바데 서와세도 소소리 시지도 대야게 당기 와라 당분간주 초리 전기라는 잠지 랑게 남미 랑게 롱바 랑게 시시에세 잠지와라 텔레테네 첸디 강에서야 대화투에 탑시셔제 만주자 물리강가 니마드만다 야게 신탄다 내가 제대로 뒤던다 지요라 그 첸디 좀 좋아 대야더니 초리 제로와 다 진짜 말했어. 다들 semnyam고도 송거라 강가랴. 당님 인지 전부 깨워야. 니리 매배 자와디스 탐절이 깨워라. semnyam고로 단단가라서 소소 가사요래 녀사요래 텔 야가치를 도가들이야. 동에다 트레나 상금하러 콜도부 존나 삼그라. 텐데 삼면도스티 semnyamba 당님도 시디 투고르서. 단데 사실 빼자는 소리도 shen tondo tamgere jene tambo sade rabe yone tondo yawo ke mardo chude to yawo sako ko nyambo chi abu sogores tangyum shero o ti tambo di shegdo shina ne tambo tangyum shede kongure sungore te kande resna tela nyinji kombe remba tambo shegdo jogba ne samde ta tambo nyinji chembu yoyage remba tambo de kande se karele jogure sena ne 저벌 저어서 대시에게 송교도 단데마 땅용기 시디 두고요래 토마리시 땅용 공배 심제 탐제라 제소 착바다 컨트롤 셀데 뇽베 심니 두벌 저어서 당부데 가지고 단다 가려서나 네 땅용 공 심제 탐제라 제소 착바다 심제 가실이야 제소 차네 현자 요르노 도마조나 삼야부조나 삼제코 제수 착배왕기 다와텐도 동에 텐도 요래 가셀이야 베 콘도세네 디마조나 삼제 친줄로 삼로 요르바 어텐데 다 삼로데 매버서 그랬어라 되네 제수 착바다 컨트롤 세데 가셀이야 컨트롤 제대 요르나 디바세 그랬어거다 단데 자첨보 제제 저 망보 삼로 단에 다다 삼로 되그래 천데 장장 삼로 단에 갈리 가부요다 천디 파마다니 니도도리아 잠제 용야데 카레스네 소소 탄달이 아부체사 티라 티케와 ngamal에 저랑 된데 생게 미데 시케네 요르 다스요라 티탄다데 코레 야그마로 셴다 쇼구라 티탄다 카와요랑 티드바 킨데시데 밀레카 텐데케 요마라 팅ngamal라 카와케나 텐두데 시케나 카와케나 소소레 참바데 자와 쳔게 천디 파마나 신년데 나시 사사나시 야부 부두나시 컨디션에 자와 컨데 요 텐데 나시 껴ngamal라 저랑 텐데 생게 요라시 팅ngamal라 요레 타탄다 코치엔도라 키스페는 와마셰라마도 샹고네 전에 껴ngamal 파마다 녀녀데 카레네 티탄다 가주 예나 가주 게 소르게 마도 근데 뭐네 래 까진 전부 제로와 교황아마 망부 요래 교심마 망부 요라 챈딜레 카시 까진 전부 제로다 가지 제로도와 까지 제나 마제베 tonda 마로 코 제르다 가지 제스 땡기 오마로 어디 인도한테 봐 세구레스고도 가서 토와 카셜 콘도시에데 마제베 제제 10년반이 두고 그래서 10년반이 두버 자오송도 땅님 두고 그래서 다다님 간데서 좀 그러잖아. 단디 마셔도. 심지어 탐제 대화에도 다님 죽고베 주생 가래서나. 상말이야 찍바전에 천대 파만년이를 사자 보고 보돌아서 봐 간데 저와여 반나시 탐제를 semnyam고베 주생 가래서나. 념고야면도 어디 가르진 고거래서나. 그봐. 심지어 탐제 대화도 찍바로 봐자래. 소소이나다 랑게 파마년데 센디 랑게 참지 요새도이나다 상마 미션다 상마 대완도 동에 면도버지 나 야가 주나 섬도 마주나 섬게 자르마도 두부 주나 가생게 된데게 요 말도 탐제 대완도라 동에 면도바데 냠바로 와서라 탐제 대완도라 동에 면도라서 소소년이도 돼. 저 통만 매번나라. 저 통만 매러. 따단단 아주 센디지부 삼다 요 말와. 저 삼로 단디자. 저 통만 매번에 저랑 저랑 좀 밀레제 할레제 던들게 가와 가서갈게 요노. 대상만에 센디 파마다 년이도 다 가바 니부 대장자 거래 접 대고 말와. 샹다 용구로 단단 아주 오신 말노. 어때 이제 심지어 탐제에 파담마다 년이 돌아서 봐. 마주르인데 유리어 말해서 면도 아시고 요 말해서 티인데 고 교황아마 같은 신부제나 같은 신부제라 다들 소소 제소로 마다 티인데 수고도 동해 면도 반에 냠세 토마 매반에 토마 매바전 코아나 심제 Kang se semje kandeji na len jaja mangbolo soso nyende june pada mada nyende nyendun zashila soba o tende tana lobe la soba wa ran labje jange la soba o tende majuro chi yo ma re se no nyende jurba te kaya medo nyamdo yonso samshin so o tuzen dereta kachen kheba se yora se gora tangazu nagba che jonga che kelenge jina Chidan Mishigare Chere, Tanda Kadu de la Kabuchenge de la Kaja Degra, Nemalo, Nisusum Jungelia, Yabuche, and Tito, Shabes and Chido, Combi, Marab Sabi in Beta and Gira, Shangone, Chanema Yabuche, Tanda Yabuche, Nima Yabuche, or Tidingal Yabuche, Kalaka, Yabuche, some Manga Tintango, no. Tishiga de Gio, the Cotis, Sonza, Tikanga Yabuche, the Abuche, and do the Tandangam Train, the Giona. Joangama rangi pamata nyenye dula sokwa ti treni tsawa shivuji yoche tsendile lakwa mene duweke yungma no. Tindende tanda dhaba zi shenda zi che deyo na ngore shena dhani tsawa shivuji yunguri no. Tanda ko tsawa tende yungwe shiji redo, de hama ko mongsa che sonzang che heke yomar no. O ti yindu ti gyusen tiri ta. Simjen Koran zunga ne tsende pama nyendile soba dan shenda dhuzi tsamade dewa dole dunga mendoba ngaram jikban duwa sigora. Tsuwa didu menge todan saka sori tende reyo mara. Ene soso pen tokwa chane samlu taki ene konzo ke soso pen to yoris. Kyawa kade kaje lang yore, tezule len kyatra mangbo soso tsende pama nyendile soba kiran cheba chesa kande chune tina shimajuwa simje yo maro asigora. Ene ta nyirin che kwaya kari do sigora, nyirin cha merung re sungwa toda. Thoma meba jen semje kanda tage nyendu ma jurba kanya medo nyamdo yonsu samshi. Tela cheta chishi ne ta keba kari che yan do sigora. Lala ne che so cha, kiran keba kari chen chigo se. Kashe le cha nibe yakbu yinsi che che, shenja che che, tsawa che, kashe le kondu che, megawa che, kashe le tangyum che, taga siu she, tisu kari chen chigo re sigora. Lola la ne kontro war juba te dawe na daage simje tamjela somba ni nyomba ni tuba da sem nyomgo yense nyomba tuba yense gore tangyom nyini mebe tangyom dera tanda ngashi nyawa so sabaje chawaje ngashi rewa so tar so tende so te me abate so gore so gora o dela cheda chi kontro war juba te dawe na daage simje tamjela sem nyomba ni do tuba chawo te dar yela chashin parmecho ne samdes o tende tende nyomba tuba samde ne tangbo sem nyomsa de da kurim shege wara tangbo sem nyomsa de tarajine namsa samdani nyom to mardo tangbo chidan mi rala kabo me kontro mandi ba menge chidan mil samlo to chera ta kontro ne khashe mi kyuche yo mara dele yabure che sucha de yabu medu sam kontro chege yo mara ko yirin chege medu 당님 공수 컨트롤 semnyam 대냠 소나시고 대체라서 다 semnyam제기 구름 지셔게 와라 삼루단다래 나와래야 다 배드 조선 거다 어디 교르서 되게 야 디바도
Yeah. Okay, sorry, that was a little bit of a long stretch. So here, then when it comes to teaching compassion, it's going to be taught in various stages. We're going to go through these various stages of teaching compassion. And first, we'll begin with this developing of equanimity. So first, we need to recognize that we all naturally have this thought of love and compassion for those that are we feel close to, those that we consider to be our friends and family and so forth. We have the thought that may I have happiness and may I be free from suffering, as well as when it comes to those that are around us, that we consider to be close to us. And really, this is based upon their having shown us some sort of kindness. It is based upon recalling the kindness of others that we have a thought of, oh, this person is close to me. May they have happiness. May they be free from suffering. And so really, we need to recognize that we all have this kind of foundation of love love and compassion. And this is the kind of foundation that we need to make an effort to increase and develop such that it becomes something sort of impartial for all. So usually we have this is actually quite a motivating factor. All of our sort of efforts within this life are to accomplish our happiness and to avoid suffering, or avoid suffering for those that we love, and so forth. And so it's really, whether it's within an individual or a family, a society, this is a foundation that leads us to work for the benefit of others when we have an attitude of love and compassion, even a sort of partial kind of love and compassion that's sort of biased towards some and not extended toward all. But it is this foundation upon which we can build and develop this attitude of love and compassion for all sentient beings. So in order to remove our obstacles and accomplish our happiness, those are the kind of motivating forces. Now, when we get to this idea of great compassion, we need to eliminate that kind of sense of being close to some and distant from others. And rather, in order to develop this attitude of compassion for all sentient beings, we have to remove the kind of obstacle of partiality. So the example is often given of when we want to plant a field, if we want to get a good harvest from that field, we first have to level it out so we can plant it well. And so too, when it comes to our compassion, if we want to develop great compassion, we first need to develop this kind of equanimity toward all sentient beings. So here it says, begin the practice by meditating on equanimity. Try to actualize impartiality toward all sentient beings by eliminating attachment and hatred. So this begins by recognizing that all sentient beings desire happiness and do not desire to suffer. So we recognize that all sentient beings are exactly the same in this attitude of wanting to have happiness and not wanting to suffer. But we don't usually think of them sort of in this way, because again, as our love and compassion is normally biased, we are basing it on someone having shown us a kind of kindness in the past. But we need to expand beyond just thinking about this one life and the way that beings have helped or harmed us in this life, but think beyond that to see that there's countless rebirths. If we're Buddhist, we think that there are countless lives, previous lives, and therefore it's a matter of all sentient beings have been born in states where they have benefited us, whether it was in a prior life or one prior to that or prior to that, whether we were born as humans or gods or animals. We have had connections with all of these beings, and it's really a matter of not recognizing, not remembering the kindness that they have shown us. And so usually when we get angry at some or we recall the kindness of others, we have this kind of love and compassion that is partial, but we need to eliminate that, get rid of our sort of anger towards some and desire or attachment toward others by recognizing that we have had other beings show us kindness in previous lives. It's just a matter of not recognizing it. When we forget the kindness that someone has shown us, we may not have that same attitude of love and compassion. And so by expanding our attitude and recognizing that we have had these relationships with all other sentient beings, there's none that we can point to and say they haven't acted as my friend or my parent. We, in this way, are able to eliminate that kind of partiality and recognize the kindness that all beings have shown us. So it continues by saying, think deeply about how, in this beginningless cycle of existence, there is not one sentient being who has not been my friend and relative hundreds of times. And so therefore, since there is no ground for being attached to some and hating others, I shall develop a mind of equanimity toward all sentient beings. And so here, this is, again, the kind of reasoning that establishes why we should have equanimity is recognizing first that we are all equal in having this desire for happiness and desire not to suffer, but also that all beings are equal in having shown us kindness. And thereby, we can't just think about this one kind of life, but we need to recognize all of those previous lives in which other sentient beings have shown us great kindness. But it's just a matter of we've forgotten that. We don't recognize it. And so they have acted hundreds of times as our parents, as our relatives, as our teachers, and so forth. And if we really accept past and future future lives. We need to recognize that it's a matter of not recalling their kindness, not that they haven't shown us that kindness. And so with this lack of recognition, with not remembering the kind of kindness that they have shown us, then by thinking about that, by recalling that kindness and feeling a sort of closeness to them, then we can remember that we shouldn't think of someone as being our enemy or someone as being our friend, but recognize that they have actually acted in that way of benefiting and helping us countless times in the past. So therefore, since there is no ground for being attached to some and hating others, I shall develop a mind of equanimity toward all sentient beings. And so then we'll get into the kind of beginning the meditation on equanimity by thinking of a neutral person and so forth. So again, this is the way in which we need to train our mind, think about this, and recognize that because all sentient beings have acted as our friends, as our kind loved ones, we actually should view them with this attitude of love and compassion without any kind of partiality.
Oh yeah. Tangan jo kombe rimba de shek do tangnyum komgorwa anam jinga jo semje tamje nyeri cha dan ni dan che tangyum la ne ba jo ru chi sigora tanga jo chi dan de samlutan ma do de samlutan ge omara shi tende mare so da re ne samlutan gore so gora kombe rimba se tangnyum kombe rimba shegora ti kan de sana tambu nga jo Jawa Mengen Yagada Dua Kaya Tradanye Kaya Mayenge Chitang Mitazul Pasem Yam Kurese. Telia Kashele Chakba Kawachia the Kashele Kondusagwe Yomara Randa Jawake Yomardo. O Tin de Tazulia Sem Yam Kures, Tilela Yorda, Sem Yambachore, the Yagada College South Jam Sangma, the Vandula Tunga Mendevare, Ranguna Kondusangbalia. Chawache gore chamba kom gore samsa tendeche mesere samtan nyom gore chera ti chedan de nyam sem nyamete lela gre ta ti chela suyo no o tene yela cha kabaleso la nyam tada yela cha parme chone chamde seda parma sera tada ni kaya mayenge paru semje yor no me yor no rande do me go kontor ba sem nyam chukure sa o sem nyam chukure te nyame de lela gra rang ya ga cheba de do je ke she me tu za ko nyirin che ko yo mara o ta chamde se parme chone chamde se zashi na tene so sun zashi changmalia so sun na mi ta ni do da ji ni je da tu yo ro ho tu le sem nyam gore chera ngaran ju ji na kai na 파마이나 부글이야 니 따야래 연구도 하시 tunde 제교 말서 참말 식반이 싶다고 그래 송고도 가셔를 또 스카르 전에니 지부대야 선반미게 tunde 제교 요르도 바 자실은 섬냠 그래서 라게 자시 바다 마당에 다니도 부부둘라 속바다 제줄에 파 섬냠 그러와 에티나 시트로보 생각하는 제 소수남균에 존지 생계게 명호심보다 대여 대졸 sem냠고 요라 당분게리아 자시다세 대조 강가냠 손에네 자 소수남주 자체된 게 메가스 제세지어도 차도 제세연한다 콘도 제세연한다 남신 제세연한다 sem마가 제세지어라 오 대졸에 sem냠고래 세거라 다 대조 소수 parme semjanda ni do da chikbare se ta thu de ta gora semnyam se do za parme semjada tunga so se ni pama yendele so ba da chikbare ne tamadelia tawadelia semnyam e tabsi chodo tawado jo tato jo so so ni de da chikbacho semnyam ne tangen namju samlu tende tangi oren dio mare tamerong are sa ni do me gyo yo mar tanda ngaju tar jindenge to ya Tiawangama namso ranganye nidu chene chende pamale habo mambu cheyo no take tengi wa marwa dewa ngaju chi donali ngudwa kera kashel ka je kashel do ngal shibu sosu nyende chodale shibu ka je de tende ke yo ma tezo nyema kera sebe ta chene tubutang kaje tranga yo ma re chera ene phaje de to je tade dimension maga che kare sera 교황아치 데 소소 데둘 찍으라 센데 데도 장자 말아 교황아 나만합수 중에 데도다 마바 용주 강가 데도 소소 양을 찍으라 어제자고 Kyongama Namsu Tanda Susu Kawani Sajasu Trachi and Susu Sabada Tende Tagakayo Mare. And it said the Banda Trade Singer to the Kyongama Susu Nini to Kande Chayoshi, Tanda Tengi Omado, Cesar Tarison Yang Maris, Tale Sem Yamburtitos Kalekagrido. Tatunda, what to do, Susu Miki Carne, Susu Namji Makasuna Telemini, Conguado, Atange Kul Trashes in Inter. Tanzania careers and Korakianga and Kepada Madan Yen send it to Lawache Girisam. That under thoughts a dream and is sent it under a thoughts a dream and Sicilia. Then there's some Rana Maro, some young Toshichora. Oh, Tijere, Hindi matter. Semyam Banya Tunet, and some gentamjelo, somebody Tradanye, the Parma, somebody, Sosa Tonte, the good Yamsona. Rova. Then Jonathan Sosa Namjing Washington, Fogba, and the Trongbata, Tinde comes in Gudwa. Trongbata to some yam to teach, and the Parujilla Sim Jetam just said, Takanga Chibaresha, some young but to come to Kuyorno. Or the Nessim Jetam Jella, some young bandy to Tumne, some Yabo Yamson, Tachamba, Chamba Conveg and got some good. Tawada China, some Chamba Conveg, Tawada Treber Tuji, some Shesem Manyamna. Traduzole Tawada China Yamba Samba Ketumado, to which Jona Samba Yangayordo. Or did you, Jona? Yeah.
So here then we get into the kind of stages of developing equanimity, of meditating on equanimity. And this begins then with this idea of begin the meditation on equanimity by thinking of a neutral person, and then consider people who are friends and foes. So here, when we say are doing the four immeasurables, and we recite like, may all sentient beings abide in the state of equanimity, free from attachment to some and hatred for others, and so forth. That's a more kind of general, aspirational sort of wish. But here, when one is meditating on equanimity, we're actually doing so in a way where we really begin it with a kind of personal, observing an individual. And here, we start with someone that is neutral to us, someone that we don't really have a particular kind of attachment for or aversion for, but rather someone that is neutral. And so it's easier to begin by meditating in a sort of neutral person, and then expanding out toward those that are our friends and relatives, and then finally to those that we perceive as being enemies. And so here, when we are beginning this kind of meditation, again, we are starting with a specific individual, but it should be someone that we really have a kind of neutral feeling toward. And then we can begin to add in those that we see as being like our friends and our relatives. And then we expand out to those that we maybe dislike, that we see as being like enemies, and those that we sort of have an aversion toward, and try to have get to the point where we have a similar feeling toward all of these beings, thinking that they are all exactly equal in not wanting to suffer and wishing to have happiness. And then this is, again, something where we're going to need to make an effort while we are in this meditation to try to get rid of this feeling of holding some as being our enemies and holding some as being our friends. Because again, we are really in a state of just not recognizing it, being so focused on the affairs of this life. We can't recognize the way in which those that we designate as enemies have potentially helped us greatly in previous lives, maybe in just our past life. So there's no real certainty about who's an enemy and who's a friend. And so we can't just limit our understanding to the kind of happiness and suffering of this life. But thinking to many previous lives, we can see that really we can't hold someone as being, oh, this is my enemy, and then this one is my friend. Those things are not really certain. And so in this way, we can expand out from thinking about a neutral person and then thinking about those that we think of as our friends and relatives, and finally to those that we normally hold as being people we don't like or we feel aversion toward. And we are able to expand in this way to have the kind of equanimity toward all. We should develop this such that when we're engaged in the meditation, we begin with a sort of neutral person, expand out to those that we consider to be friends, those that we further expand to those we consider to be enemies, and then try to like expand through our area and so forth, all the way to all sentient beings, and recognizing that they're all the same in wanting to have happiness and not wanting to suffer. And once one has developed this kind of equanimity toward all sentient beings, then one engages in this meditation on loving kindness, which is developing the sincere wish for all of these beings equally to have happiness.
Oh yeah. That didn't tanyum de disarwa. Sashi nyamba tan chipa cheche to semnyamba chera niring semnyamba. That is chele niba delia chambe sembyelamba sudwa. Ninji kumjul ma she understand. Chambe sembyelamba semje tamjelia. Tawada trendeji chambe lemba sudu dando sashi de ko nyamsa sun tele chutane lemba soje ni de tondo kero sokuyo no tena she ni ba chambe sembi rang sembi de lemba chawore sembi kambo thabo me sepa jambu sokure songuyo no chambe chu sembi kyulende se seriye be sashi shindo Shela se Ningji Sabin Tamnas Serio Basa de Shajan Yubatil Sura de Lambrin Tina de Yumbu Tani de Chen Cadio Maris Santa Musera Serio Basa de Lamba del Segore, certain mu said del Segio Mare. Nazo Tronsepolia Shinga Ngodi Nima Jama Jab Shinga Ngo to the Milan one Donald Lab. Seria bunduga sigre tonsebala seria bunduna se tonse je o seria bunduga sigre shajan ya bunduga tendo ke sa kambuchan madira tele ser sigora seria be sashin do chela se chutan sigora seria be sashin do chela ningji sabin tamna se tatelia sashi khonyam sashi lamba yeba shane ta ningji sabin de ma tamne chanju sembi nyugu ya ke tanda ningji sabin de ma tabure songordo ningji sabin tamna tala do shin do yong se keban juro se ene changsem ge nyugu de ya shin do keban jure se gorno ya ge do de se ya cher shin keban juro se tene sembi kyu chambe ko ne Niji kombar chawase semgi kyude chambe semde yagboche rangi konjol nyambache lepsona ene niji komgore songyorno no techi kyona ya no de.
So here, then, we begin with this development of equanimity, which is like leveling the field. When one wants to gain a good harvest, one needs to begin by leveling the field. And then once one has developed that kind of equanimity toward all sentient beings, one should meditate on loving kindness. And it says here, moisten the mental continuum with the water of loving kindness and prepare it as you would a piece of fertile ground. So once you've leveled out this field, you then kind of moisten your ground with this attitude of loving kindness. So here in the Tibetan text, and I believe this is in all there's a typo that makes it look like ser, like a gold, but really here what it's talking about is like good fertile ground, like when you're sort of digging things up and you get these good chunks of dirt. Like in the towns, they would say, like, does your field have a lot of good sere? So it's like a kind of fertility to it that comes from having watered that field. And then once one has thoroughly watered the field and prepared it in that way, you plant this seed of compassion. And so when the seed of compassion is planted in such a mind, germination will be swift, proper, and complete. So once you have irrigated the mind stream with loving kindness, meditate on compassion. And this is the kind of, these are the stages in which one goes in order to give rise to this sprout of bodhicitta. It is by first developing this kind of equanimity and then loving kindness, followed by the seed of compassion that will help us give rise to this attitude of bodhicitta.
Boya, oh, the Kamalashila. Oh, the Tatanema, Tatanda de Niji Kumjuchita, 잠베섬 빌란 니지 콤바차 소르와 다 니지 콤주 셰거라 니지 콤주 치다 니지 콤주 셰거라 치다 니지 콤주 셰거라 니지 데네 심제 동해와 탐제 대단 자와라 되베 넘버 니지 세드 가르 시그레스네 심제 동해 젠도 줄이야 동해 대다 자와 되베 자와들 시그레스 니지 모티레 송거라 니지 데네 심제 동해와서 동해 용게도 시그라 동해와 탐제에서 심제 동해와 심제 탐제 동해 대다 자원 되베 네 남바chen 기심주텔에서 그래잖아 지 오래 지식도지나 지단이 지금 지식도네 감성배 심제 탐제네 동해니 남바섬게 감성게 심제 탐제 동해게 간데서 나게 와서네 동해 숨지 나게 와서 감성세는 동감 송감 송미 감식이라 동감스도 냐와 예다 던르다 미트 단 dollar 도선 동감식도 송감스도 삼대 당보 니버 송바 시바스제 땡지 꼼네 사예되니 네토솔이아니 송감식이라 수신도 야부여게와 토솔식이다 데베 감성한주 동감 도솔이아 도연레 세발라 소바다 지 착변도 잘해 소바다 텐데 세바셰 첨부여서 동감식이서도 네 송감식 수신도 제바 텐데 녀모 라바도 매바선자 송감식 삼대시데 수미 감수리야 소보 맹겐게 띵지 장장 냉겐게 사이릭 텐데 요르노 남과타에 남시타에 지야 메시지 셔라 꼼점네니 띵지 장장 내데 소보 맹게 텐데 사이 내 텐데 요르노 띵지 템부셔 어때줄 수미 감식도 소보 매백함 감송배 심장 탐제 내세 동해 넘버 숨 찌릭 바라 신도 동해와 다임바 감송제 심제 탐제 동해 넘버 숨제 내 찌릭 바 나르게 와레서 카셰 동해기 나르게 와레 카셰 교레 동해기 나르게 와레 카셰 캬반 도지기 동해기 나르게 와레 동해 숨셰도 동해기 동해세 동해기 동해서 간주 남주 하고야 전주 연제 고나에 다 강반에 다 지지 나차 용에 요르노 전주 관계 하고게데 어딜에 동해에서 그 가제 되나 동해기 당부 동해를 가제 나는 거래 나는 고나에 대대버도 동해나 양 대주르노 동해에서 그래 교래 동해에서 소화 대화도 쓰여봐 소화 대화도 소리야 근데 변나 캬서나 타네니 니모 좀 부러질 파치제 사회 체세질 실력서는 아니 좀 부셔 대화 연구라 양코데 가진 체소네 응나 체제데 되니 도마르 동에 원준도라 어토제 단들은 교로 동에 스탠다드 대화선지 소화요라는 거죠 코에 대화 상만 대화도 강에라고 직 파세소나 타야버 중소선 소소 대화론 바인시요라 오늘 전에 대화 있는 그 템부제 대고 그래도 주단 깬데 위는 다가 대고데 대그 말에 대외 교진데 위나야 대화 대토고 말에 버르진 교제 동에 된도요라 제가 교로의 동에서 단대 대회에서 소르기와데 다들 여행지 대다는 거야 동행 오교로 가르노 저는 교로의 동에서 거라 소화 삭제지 소화 대화도 쓰기와데 녀모가 왕기 중에 소화 대화인데 가르노 어떠죠야 개반 두지기 동에서 돼 감솜가를 개배샤네 개바시거도 두지기 동에서도 자 삭제지 레다 아니 녀몽배왕게 총회 풍부터 줄라 두지 동에서 거라 녀몽당 사제지 레당 녀몽배 두지해봐대 되니 왕게 총회 풍부이나 이 개반 두지 동에서 감송가리 캡겨르지 레당 녀몽배 샤와전이 총회 풍부지어라 루이나 루게 연구 말에 수지 넘버 10에 풍부라 써봐 깨와라 써봐 어틀리시거라 어디 감성걸 잡거든 두지 동에데 동감래 두지 동에 와르 성감래 와르 성미 감래 와르도 동에지 동에데 동감다 도바셰셔마도 성감 대줄이야 교르 동에다 되니 가서래 카반 두지 동에다 되죠 여마도 동에 셴다 간가 요마도 디 동에 숨차듯이거라 그래서 신도 동해와 인베티 그걸로서 감성배 섬제 탐제네 동해니 넘버 섬제 찌릭바 신도 동해 가시 동해 숨각 나고요 가시 찌릭 나고요 어딘데 찌릭바 Shindu Dungawa Tayin Betis, Simjan Tamjala, Te Combarcha, Tetan Trena, some Comguristi, Chita, Kamsum, Simjan Tamja, Simja Condition, Tungaji, Tungajan Narangi, Tungana, Kevin Duji, Tungana, Tesu Sama Tamja, Tungajan Trena, Yadu Char, Gurji, Yamba Otsa, Delia, Chita Ninja Comjure, Oh, Tandinema, what I'll teach you now.
So here, then we turn to the meditation on compassion, how to go about meditating on compassion. What is this attitude? So it says here under the heading of identifying the nature of suffering, that the compassionate mind has the nature of wishing all sentient beings to be free from suffering. So in general, this is what we are talking about when we say compassion, is that kind of attitude, that kind of wish. That is the essence of compassion. And we should meditate on this kind of compassion for all sentient beings, because all the beings in the three realms of existence are intensely tortured by the three types of sufferings in various forms. So within the cyclic existence, we have the desire realm, the form, and the formless realm. In the desire realm, so-called because we have a great deal of desire for the objects of our senses, in particular those kinds of physical desires, we have the 5 or 6 types of beings, the hell beings and hungry ghosts and animals and humans. And then there is the form realm, wherein one is born as sort of a celestial being, a godlike being, by having attained these meditative concentrations, the first, second, third, or fourth meditative concentration. And one could also be born in the formless realm, wherein there is no kind of physical form, but one has attained these deep states of meditative stabilization, stabilization like that of limitless space, limitless mind, nothingness, and the peak of samsara. There are these various stages of meditative stabilization that one can have attained. But these three realms are all pervaded by suffering, are all in the nature of suffering, because the 3 types of suffering pervade there are the 3 types of sufferings that are not all applicable to all of those realms. But we have first the type of suffering that we recognize as being suffering, the kind of suffering of suffering it's sometimes called. And this is those types of suffering that so long as it is around, we identify it as suffering. So whether it's like our head hurts or our foot hurts or we have some sort of sickness, so long as that lasts, we recognize and identify that as suffering. And this is something that the beings in the desire realm are subject to. Then there is the suffering of change, and this is really referring to all feelings of happiness, contaminated feelings of happiness within cyclic existence. So, for example, when we are, say, afflicted by cold and we move into some nice sunlight, well, before we know it, we're sweating due to the heat of that sunlight, and we have to change again. So all of the kind of feelings that we experience, these contaminated feelings within samsara, are not stable. It's not as though we can count on anything. They're always going to change into something else. And this becomes in the nature of suffering. So this is the second type of suffering that beings are afflicted by. And then there is the suffering that pervades to all levels of existence, whether it is the desire form or formless realm. All levels of cyclic existence are pervaded by what we call this pervasive suffering of conditioned existence, the state of having taken up these contaminated aggregates due to the force of karma and afflictions. So whether that is a physical form like we have in the desire realm or the form realm, or something that's just of a mental nature like in the formless realm, this is all subject to being under the power of karma and the afflictions, and thereby is suffering. So here, these 3 types of suffering, that kind of abject suffering, the suffering of change, that's really our contaminated feelings of happiness within cyclic existence, as well as this pervasive kind of suffering of conditioned existence. These are the kinds of ways that sentient beings are tortured, as it says. So meditating in this way on compassion for all sentient beings, because of the fact that the beings in the 3 realms, 3 realms of existence, are intensely tortured by these 3 types of suffering. So this is the kind of contemplation in which one engages.
Oh, yeah. Tadine ma karishek dosana de nyingji kumju de doa rido soso cheja nyingji kumju kebar shek doa. Dina ne tambu ngesong ki tanda tangma de shede tunge sum gichi rikbe sum jendam tunge de dada trena shimaru tewar juji tewar chawa shayad tende shene chita nyingji kumju she songa. Tandine ma sum jen doa rido soso tunge samje nyingji kumju kebar shek doa. Didare rishi semje nyewe semje kanda yemba teda tatambu nyewe tunge samde nyewa lingi komgu yordo teda rishi semje nyewe tunge nyewe semje kanda yemba teda ne kyume cheche yunringwa sawa la sokbe tunge nazo je chur chingba kona yino se o chawe chanye yina chawe tunge me sekbe tunge nyongu yordo chanye yina sokbo chakwa ngo june ne tunge nyongu yordo dina shi tunge mambu nyewa tunge mambu yore sawa sera rapsa ser tati shetan in gondore sawa sera rwa chagi kangpa memba andaba tinde na leptebe sigora sawa rapsa se tinde nisum ya tuidebe tinde sigora sawa rapsa se ina narme se lui korante me memba arche me ngo yudungero tudu sigda narme se Chawarapsa nami tingjum se ya simje mambo su ruru suni dini eni ri sundondaba ya shebar ta ralu senge de tinde ne teta te namba chengi pa namba rab tinde ta mambo she do ta she moja nyawa ta chanye tonge che chanye do tamo chakba ge temne sobu chakba dang o chikpa che kendo medo ne shipa kendo tinde mambo sora 또 마신데 그래 어디서 다들 매가 그 말통은 저 배전한 송도 녀에 동에 제때 버데 밀라 요세 밀라 롱바 멤바네 배 메자탄의 시험만 보는 것도 매 메자 겸네 세바 용거도 칸에 착바 겸네 택시테바 강리르버데 루두산 미강가 칸에네 티치도 아까서 속보 착바 겸네 신도거라 Pearlton Yore. Kanlian Rudusani, make I send Roma can teach it. Nida Tangur Segda, Tungur Segda. Don't any country say, don't could get transportation, could do Tedene, Tabaja, so what Tabaja and the Shidoda. Or dinner, she could to get Miller. Never to get Sandra Miller, you are sitting as some Tunguda. So just say, get to the Segre, Pansi Tangere, Tending as a Miller Yora. Yore Senako yi mache came down as you some tongue. Tina sing a simple re mambo. Sabe tunge mambo yotanga, Tame tunge mambo yotanga yordo, Yawa Sanye Tranye ser. Tezo Karsore, Shenaku and that Kanga Mardo. Tende Kawa Dusan Dugas and as a mille yordo. Ida Rabicinaco Saeme, Tunge, Mimugi Mambo Shigdoa. Tina she ida Dozuliaco Saeme, and Sobo come to Tende Tunge Yagi ordo. O tende tunge she bunyonge o tezu le nyawa si yida si yongo o tezu tunge so shegdo ta tezu ya yore da se tezu keji ge gyunde ka gore se so lagba yobe shegyo do mewa jeli yor se zentang yo mara tende tunge nya yor da tunge gyunde da si pa ka gore ma do tele ke nyanga yor da tele meje ba khana shegore da se so ran yor da se so lagba yor da se yor do Ninji Sembo de so lagba yo ne kang che ne singa ju kaban do ma do so lagba yo ba che dirwa o da di ma mu she dire o da di ma ndanga do a de da rishi semje nyewe semje kanda yemba te da ne gyu me che je gyu ring bu de dang ara ju mi che den ding ma re nyewe che je do she do yu ring bu she yor do ta yu ring bu de go ser do te ba sel sim bu sa ben de bulia Kimi cheche yin la sawa la sokbe sawa da chakba la sokbe tunge na zo je churu chingba ase kona yin no se tunge je churu ja chimbu ya tene semja ma chingba na shi tunge ja chunal ma chu do ni yudin bu ba do tunge nyam de kure songora she chomden de je katse do se tzo kanga sanje de no le song sha se yeni songor ma do men songor tanda yo mardo Teshendo ida namla ane ida dunge sam gurda. Nyewe dunge tuzu sam tende yore sam simje shendale nyingche kom ne raya tende ke tikba de sana tele kigre sam nga tele meje ba chego sam sa niga nyamdo sam tang gordo shinda temo tange sore che nyawa to tende nyang de ge are khanda sam sa lenge ba sa ne sam sa tie sam gore so tele ya lenge ba sa ne tin tamam be ne kaje ke shi tande ma ba na kewa tsendele tende tikba chimbu sa me ne kewa nga ma khanda sa shi sam tendele ke sigre sam nga tendele ke na nge tende tunge nyongu de me kewa chego sam ngar sakbe lenge ba to zule shakba che tsendele tene me ke le ma sakba che kewa thongma me ne sa she ma bu yo de zule nge ba che shakdom che o tende che gu yo do deshen do ida namja peje shindu mi sebe te ba sa sa me thongye me ne togbe tunge yeshi do to sigo do Treba da komba ni chutunye da tende mene tunge yangi wado kombe tunge je semte kombe tunge la so tende sembien mambu nyongo rese ani lu kamba lu shindu tunge waso lu be shin kambu chawana shinje saye tunge mene pa lu kamdo to sigo kambe lu shindu tunge mambu nyongo sheka che dos 다나 시 던도 남라야 찍래 찍 사와 다들 아주 던도 동 되기도 티베다 도즈나 땡기도 찍게 세네 다 칼레도 하테 다 카는 카면 사고로 치 사야서 띵냥가래도 사야 던도를 시켜내 고 샤다다 라다 tin데 깨네 아부데 삼고도 코코 사이즈 사는 사모도 파사는 티베 전부 사야게 메도 다 현대도 파 사야 거라 그 마산에 짜네 사고도 현대 사고도 네 사야지 사야지 마도 가지이나 그 뒤삼도 다되고도 뒤인데 또 찍래 찍 사회 동에 된데 요래서 티셔도 가래서 던도 남자 찍래 찍 사와다 남중간 주세 시그라 찍래 찍 사회 동에서 아니 그가서 내시 때문에 동에서 로 아니 현재 Mila soba shanda yang segra ngal pakba de koyo sere ngal ya chwa de koyo sere ngal kera riba de koyo sere cheje seyora rezan ko bien temo betonge se chigle chi sawe tonge shenge koyo ge tonge peje cheje ke ne ta ande ne je se to je tende sigora tendo namja chigle chi sawa da thoa da Sebada number sewala sobe tunge number mangbo nyowa konar na ngose o tiba de chilam kamata sendo mata ta de zo nyawa ida tendo de tunge samne te zoli nyinji komya ne raya de lenge basa ba te zoli kena tene tunge mambo nyongu do sam te zoli meje chego sam sa samlo ko yora o ya te do.
So here then we get to this meditation on compassion and recognizing here. We can, it goes into a kind of extended meditation on compassion by thinking about the various types of sufferings of these individual types of beings. So in general, having this thought of wishing for others to be freed from their suffering, whatever sort of being in all these three realms, whatever kind of suffering they're experiencing, may they be freed. That is a kind of general thought. And then we go into the individual sort of meditations on the sufferings of various realms. So the Buddha has said that heat and other types of pain constantly torture beings in the hells for a very long time. So thinking about like the hell realms, we have these various realms that are described in other texts, like hot and extremely hot, and we're talking about there being burning houses of fire and so forth, and this kind of unrelenting torture of suffering. And so this is the kind of contemplation that we should engage in, thinking about the various types of hells. And this is something where we can think about them as being hell beings. Like there are hell beings that will be born in such hells and have extremely long lives and so forth, both the sort of hot hells and the cold hells. But we can also extrapolate and think about the kind of sufferings of hot and cold that humans experience. We don't need to be able able to directly see the hell realms to know the kind of suffering that the hell realm could cause. We can look around the world and see that there are those who die by fire, say, those that die of cold. Like there are some Tibetans who, trying to cross the mountains, were unable to survive. They died of hypothermia in those mountains. And we can see that many types of beings experience these sufferings of hot and cold. And so too, when it comes to the kind of sufferings of hungry ghosts and so forth, we can see that those sufferings of hunger and thirst are also sufferings that we as humans experience. There are many who die of famine and die from hunger, and we can look and see those kinds of sufferings within humans as well. And this is not something that is described in order just to scare us, but it's really for a purpose, for generating compassion toward those beings who are afflicted by those types of suffering, who are tormented by those, and also to recognize that we don't want to be born there, that we want to eliminate the kind of causes that would lead us to take such a rebirth in such a suffering realm. So when we talk about these kinds of suffering situations, we can look at the kinds of sufferings on the basis of a human, but when we're talking about the length of life of, say, a being who was born in the hell, it's extremely, it's much, much, much longer than an ordinary human being's kind of life. And here it says in the text, the Buddha has said, so this is something that is taken from the Buddha's teachings. And we need to think about this in terms of not just like we're looking at a movie, like, oh yeah, there's the suffering of the hells over there and the suffering of the hungry ghosts over there, and it's sort of something from which we are disconnected. But we actually need to have a feeling about this, that what would it be like if I were to be born in such a realm, subjected to such sufferings and torment? And we need to actually think about what it is like for those beings in order to generate compassion. In terms of thinking about it for ourselves, it causes us, it incites us to make an effort to not accumulate the causes to be born in a realm like that. And recognizing that we have accumulated since beginningless time all kinds of negativities and non-virtues, we're impelled to engage in a process of confession, of purifying those negativities that we ourselves have accumulated. And then we also are able to, on the basis of this, generate compassion for others. Like looking now at the animal realm, we can also see that, he has also said, the Buddha has also said that hungry ghosts are scorched by hunger and thirst and experience immense physical suffering. And again, this is something we can also think about in relation to humans. And we can see the struggles of animals are particularly apparent to us. We can also see animals suffering in many miserable ways. They eat each other, become angry, and are hurt and killed. Now, normally we see the struggles of animals described. We often get this, they eat each other. So if you are born as a predatory kind of an animal, you have no choice but to kill others in order to sustain yourself. That is part of the kind of suffering that you endure as that type of an animal. And we often see that not only do they sort of eat one another, but there's also this level of stupidity, of delusion that comes with being born as an animal. And when one is born as an animal, one is also subject to the kinds of exploitations from humans. Maybe it's not just even for your meat to be able to eat you, but just for your fur or something that we want on your body. Animals are sort of treated as disposable for humans. And so in this way, we should contemplate individually the types of suffering of these various beings in order that we generate compassion for them, but also with that, a kind of desire to not accumulate the causes that would lead us to be born in such a realm ourselves.
Oh yeah, that me to me shake do atanashi. Minam John Deba Yonsu Service, Susan Debet on that Chene, many betung and young order. Minam John Deba Yonsu Service, Pongbe, Pone, Chigla, Chikua, the Chil Kong the Sayana, Chil, never chair. And this was a Togba Yido, Pamania, Cadola Sobotas, that Chevetung Yongora. And we took by the Chebas and Mendebe Chala Sobatan, Chitta to the Chevetung and Yongora. Ipung Jurbala Soba, and Pongba, Tilnorchala, Meva Sayetung, and Meva Sobetung and Yongudwa. You are a Sobetung, a part of Meva, nor a Nango, that me to me and the Kamalashila Sobatan, to me or to do some tane in Yishikana. Oh, tende komgumba. Kandan desha la sokbe. Nyamumbe kunde tiba nazoji. Tachitan mizun desha la sokba raba kongto nga je chado la sokba keneni sosu tunge shen tunge mambu yeke bashigyo tong kandan desha la sokba desha kongto nga je chado ge wange. Eni sosu semba miki bashe shen le tunge che tende chiyo la. Kandan desha la sokba nyamumbe kunde tiba nazoji sim tiba danse. Kanda tawa ngembada taya di chue la soba tende chane tawa tachi nga judi yakbo yin se raba tawa chane sim tu duya ta jade jaya yungu duwa ta ting san tile jamangu duwa chue yin se je chue susu chue di yang takba di mayi di kanga yakbo mari se re che che ku se re tubri chik duwa tuzu chandi se re kanda tawa ngembada na soba sing sing buyo sim sing sing jane ni rwa gyurwa tamze jan tungye je kyu yinbe 동해 교인 배에서 근데 개가 나도 개가 막 삼바 추럽는데 제 마 사쳐졌던 때는 뭐 사제 동해 연구도 개가 된댔어 강다 그래서 이거 제가 강다 개가 나도 신도 동해 코나이노 저 동해 망부냐 여러 심벌에서다 대개가 나실라 소베 동해도 어쩌네 따와다 텐데 차네 파주 축제 동해냐도와 너 데레 다테나 시팅상 뭐 투럽자이나 동해 텔레야도와 에단 밤르실로 요비네 아니 참마 텔레나시 영어바나 싱가주 강고 샤이라 안데 소데도 치게치스 소소디테 셴다 강가 영어바나 심베 소고 삼텐데도 동해냐도와 어야 다 들으셔 어찌바치셔나 미동에다
And then we turn to the suffering beings, the suffering that we as human beings experience. So we can see that the human beings too experience various acute kinds of pain. And so we have the kind of separation from those that we love or those things that we want. So here it says, not able to find what they want. They are resentful and harm one another. They suffer the great pain of losing desirable things and confronting the undesirable things, as well as the pain of poverty. So we experience this kind of various sufferings of, say, being separated from what we want or those that we love, having to meet with things that we don't want, having to meet with our enemies, having to experience misfortune and loss and so forth. And so they suffer the great pain of losing the desirable things and confronting undesirable things, as well as the pain of poverty. There are those whose minds are bound by various fetters of afflictions like craving. Others are in turmoil with different types of wrong views. And so here, this is, we can see how it is that we are under the control of our various afflictions, whether it is desire, attachment, pride, hatred, jealousy, and so forth. We create all kinds of suffering for ourselves. And on the base of having wrong views, of holding, say, the view that one's own view is superior to others and sort of looking down upon others, we create all kinds of fights between us over what is right and what is wrong and so forth. And so we can see that all these kinds of bad views in addition create our kinds of suffering, whether it's thinking that, like, well, my religion is better than your religion, even those types of wrong views lead us to further suffering. And these are all causes of dukkha. So these are all these kinds of things lead us to experience suffering, these wrong views, these misperceptions, having to encounter what we don't want, and not getting what we want, things like birth, aging, sickness, and death. All of these fall into this kind of suffering that humans experience. And so therefore, these are all causes of dukkha or suffering, and therefore they are always in excruciating pain, like being on a precipice. This is sort of the description of our suffering situation as humans.
Oh, yeah, don't you? That high to me some good dollar to the someone doing them get hard to do to me some. Hanamja Tamjan Guru Dunga Nigis Guru Dungera, Tanda Kotawan of Siteo, 이나 땡주네 고통에 야야야의 삼로코네 동행 연구요도 하남자 탐전 주로 동행이기 동행 다지 대반에 주베 하 강다인 반돌하리 주도 강다인 버터다네 따도 치포와다 바탄데 부승 저번에 요리 동행 요마데 대신도나 아니 교아치마 내송을 소버진데 동행도 하고도 하고 사도족에 지 마음반에 가와께 뭐 시간을 저 하고도 전 대단히 따도 치포하다 단대 야보연에 치고 그래 삼딜 따도 대요 말삼 동행이야 요도 치포하다 동아 치망에 송을 동안에 소바 된대 삼로코네 시에네 동행하고 요도 동아다 동아라 소바 집에 냥에지 semla nena chiderdeso tinde 시에다 마음반에 계속 간데께 삼네 디semde 요레스 동에 요레스 고대와께 말에 타치도 대와께 말에서 내가 메다 단도다 텐데나 시동에도 요 말이데 부숨속바 요레데 이나고 텔레타도 대 멤버데 치와다 시베치서 가바께 삼 계속다 하고니야 동에 빼 잡고 요한버래 살아 치부 동지지 동에서도 치포하다 마음반에 계속 하고 요라 뒤지도네 덮시스케요 말아 대깨고 요라 두지기 동에 얘네 라다님뭐 생이지 그 생기 와경원이다 계제를 집행한 생기 생이데 로 탐제를 켜봐이 넣어서 다 켜반 두지기 동에서 요라 다도 송감다 송미지 감기 하도를 두지기 동에 지나로 요라 현다도 요 말이데 두지기 동에 얘네 레다 녀몬베 생이지 그 상황에서 레 삭제지 레다 녀몬베 왕기 중에 풍부티 단대지 랑데 요데 야부스 랑데 요데 테코 깨지깨지 조네 만도네 양고 니만나 시절레게 마도 따바르스테 테게 요 마도 야냐와 예다 된룰 소바 가와치도네 텐데게 요 마레 어디 인데코 두지기 동에 수다 소미 간살에 소바테저 두지기 동에 요레스 좀 두지기 동에데 감숨가 심제 탐절이어도 레다님무베 샤완데 존에 가와가와께 소소리 끼실에 라와메 풍분 돌렌레 라와메テドカレンドねラーメバレキワンゲヨングヨドドチジトンゲニネレダニョモベチェニジキューシェンジワンゲゴニダケジレランジベンガンジェンジチェニデスタンデキワサンブチトプデヨレテトンゲトンゲジュエトンゲトスメナヤコケジレレネテセドヨラケジレレネセネヤコチニカワカワチトンテンデケヨマルドティンジニバティゾサソノコ양께도 타르바토바 마루아 시리바다다 텐데게 양땡지 짱짱 곰네 시진데지 계속네 타르바 인세 텐데 삼게워데 타르바레데요 마르도 남바샤나 테네 양야마 게네 시지바도 송네게 동해야주 세바도샤라 다양테 타르바 마레샤라 가셰게 시질 계속네 타르바레세 치르바데진 테르와 땡지 템보지 야케스는 타르바토바레세요도 이나 남바체네 코타르와 마레 시지바도 손에게 동해야주 세바도 슬레긴 제부도 조사서나 드니야 가와케네 깨용거라 가르선에 다음에 동번이 또 매두잖고 돈도 레사야 요런에 마사셰벨레게 또 녀모다 저주 네버 줘요 말와 로아 카말레시라 두지지 동에 얘네 레다 녀모베 생이지 그 샤와 그고니다 계지레를 지뱅아 젠지 생이데 로아 탐절을 캬바이노서 캬반 두지지 동에데 로아 탐절을 캬바는 감 송금 송미 감 탐절을 캬바래 동에단 교에 동에데 탐절을 캬면 와 되지도나
So here then the desire realm gods, here turning to the next type of being, says gods suffer the dukkha of change. So here within the desire realm, these kinds of divine beings, these gods, they don't have the kind of abject suffering of suffering, but they have this suffering of change. Although temporarily they might have all kinds of excellent things, when it comes time for them to die, why. It says here in the text, for example, signs of impending death and their fall to unfortunate states constantly oppress the minds of gods of the desire realm. How can they live in happiness? So there is, although they may have had an extremely sort of pleasant life as a god, when they approach their death, they're losing all of that. And so they have this extreme suffering of change, of not having any kind of certainty where they will take rebirth in the future. They have no power to determine where they are going to be, and most likely they're going to fall into the extreme kind of suffering of the lower realms. And so this the suffering of gods includes having this kind of suffering at the time of death, of the uncertainty of where they will go. And now, while the forms and formless realms do not have the sort of suffering and the suffering of change, they are not free from the suffering of pervasive conditioning. And so here, continuing in the text, it reads, pervasive dukkha of conditioning is what arises under the power of causes characterized by actions and afflictions. It has the nature and characteristics of momentary disintegration and pervades all wandering beings. So even those kinds of beings who have attained this really stable states of meditative stabilization and are in the form, or say in the formless realm, have gone all the way up to, say, the peak of samsara, there's no stability or permanence to the sort of state that they have achieved. And they have no autonomy because they are still under the power of the karma and the afflictive emotions. And so when the sort of karma that has led them to take such a rebirth in, say, the formless realm, even the peak of samsara, is exhausted, they are going to have to fall into the lower realms. There are those who, having attained that kind of peak of meditative stabilization, the peak of samsara, think that they have attained liberation. And then when they fall into the lower realms, they kind of lose faith in the possibility of liberation. And so all of those states, even those that might seem so blissful, sort of like this meditative kind of state wherein there is no suffering or suffering of change, this is still under control of this pervasive dukkha of conditioning, meaning that one doesn't have any autonomy to be able to decide where one is born, but rather is under the control of karma and the afflictions. And so without the kind of realization of emptiness and selflessness, one will continue to create karma. And thus, even those beings who have a very sort of subtle meditative state in, say, the peak of samsara, are still subject to this pervasive dukkha of conditioning. And therefore, we should see that all sentient beings are pervaded by this kind of momentary disintegration and being under the control of our actions and afflictions.
Oh yeah. Tantine ma deshe doa. Tante tama den droa so tungai no chu samlutane so le niji komgyo no. Tan droa tamje le niji komju ri chitan de shek doa dene. Tewe na se droa thadane tungai ge meche barwe na do shukba yin barte la se. Tan droa de dan yem ba wang ge chi ne chi dun droa de lon droa se gora. Droa se langue de chama chene. Kichi gyuni droa ri tu lo kora chen dronge de lon droa se gora. Tenen droa thadane se tungai ge meche rabdon ba na do shukba yin barte la se. Tungai ge memba wa che yoba che tena lo butu zu pa memba sana lo drosha do ra me ba drosha do ko ya buri thungi na kan tena shin je ko tungai nya den ge yin ba chi te la se go ra tenen droa thada tungai ge meche barwa na do shukba yin barte la se shukba da sungba yin barte la tedar tungai me de ba dar tedar da tungai me de ba ta so droa ri tu la ni ko ni tungai me de batar droa memba we na do shukba me de batar tungai me de batar shen tham je te dan rao nyam do sam se sem je shen da ja tungai me de ba jang chung ba re nyam do sam se ke ma ki hu se ta tungai sam tan de sa sem ba kyo e ke che do ke ma ki hu se kan ra sa tungai gi so chon ke ma ki ta la duk be sem je de das so yi do sem je de das ora pama nye de la so ba te zo tanda zo spata de tungai me be so ri chi o de ke wa thoma me ba ne tungai de de chang nyo tanda ko ma ba na ya tha me ba nya he re de yo no Sapsore Cheja ko Tungi Che, Tashi Machine, Kotio, Toma, the Tebane Standa, Yang, Tejure de Ora. Ekemaki Tala, Dugbe, Semjen de Da. Tunge na Satan, the Tungi Toma, Mevana Tanda, Yan, Mahomba to Yang Teresam. Tatazukanga Semjen to the Chela, Pangbe number Jen, Tegital, so on as she chambesam, that the Yogoreto. Tina Samlutan de Corgi Ordo, Portugua. Kimaki Tala. Yeto onwe semje pamala sobe semje de da tunge na se tende tunge nya ku ya ti na se ne tunge de le chi da tarwa cha se tani se ta tunge de le ka de se tarwa che ku na se tani tunge wa se ra tunge ge na do tsuba shin do semje shen ya de da da chu ne te ya tunge de taro de ba de se tunge wa shin do che che so so nya ge ba na shin ge so a ke ne se go ra shin tunge nya to le Chida Taba Chashi, Tani Dungawa Shindu Cheshin, Teta Jawar Debe Nambe, Ninji Te, Tinginzela, Dugarus, Ata Nazu Ninji Kunduzan Tambu Samlutan, Jesusibu Samlutan de Yora, Tidu Tinginzina Jishani Ninji Konguiora, Tan Droa, Deba, Sawa, Patu Milichison, and Rote, Odi Ninji delivered Chevures Yorno. Anjun Dumbaraj and Samru Tanjitani, Rosan, Chita, Minashita, Mato, Chambada, Ninjita, Tangum Chita, Mab Chasara, Tendre, Mabase, Dudusa, Chisona, Dudu Lebache, would Esogura. Oh, Tenid. Tora de number Ninjite, Tinginzilla, Dubia Rooms, Ninjicom, Jasamtangi, Bekabinadra, Tenichilo Pachini. Legacy and draw me chison and dora. Cholam Tamjet on draw that debana chicadina. Tondi Risum Tamjet on the levache one nation. Simjet Tungera, Tonga, Tana, Chena, some Tawandona, or Chesu, Raja, Kawacom, Ra, Simjan Yirin, Dona, Tanyum Shana, Samsa. Nazunaske Omara, Tendrejitona, Tendrusacemado, Aninja, some Tidu Tango Yordo. Lenshite mube tunge yore kokan tante tende rede or samsa kone chutu su tango yora anga ruti tangi wa tidu lebache gure sungo yora nije tengi jela duja ron cholam tamje to ya ronde tu tamje do semje tamje la kombar chade se katu ina ya no chinju do na yongu do Rona Dana Kadu Hina ko Mega Simjentana ya Tanshi Chambe Sujin Didanyela Tene Sanjin Yadon Jurusera and the Zukanga Sanje Kutobe Kuyin Sam Toma Tingi Jamba in the Samba Ninja Komna Dinanga Sanje Dusuka Tede Samje Nyamdo Chanju Semda Ninja the Kanga to do level shall we say no. 2 times to Samje Tamjela Combat Shades. Oh, Tibetan, Jana. Nichpato Shandu. Combarchade, Setibato. Yeah. Oh, this is
So here, as we do this meditation on compassion, one can go through the kind of individual types of beings, go through each individual type of suffering. And here, then, it goes to kind of a more general thought of the sufferings of beings, where it says, therefore, see all wandering beings as immersed in a great fire of dukkha, and think that they are all like you and not desiring suffering at all. And so all of those beings that are cycling within samsara, that are propelled by their karma and afflictions, are as if they are in this like burning, a great fire of suffering, subject to all kinds of sufferings without sort of respite from that. And all of these types of beings, all of the 6 types of beings, are all the same as me, in wanting to suffer at all and wanting to have happiness. So it says, think that they are all like you in not desiring suffering at all. Alas, all my beloved sentient beings are in such pain. What can I do to set them free and make their sufferings your own? So in this way, we should think about the sufferings of sentient beings and really try to take them on ourselves. And this is based upon seeing sentient beings as sort of desirable, as something that we feel a kind of kinship to. So where it says here, all my beloved sentient beings are in such pain, we need to, again, have developed this kind of feeling of closeness, of tenderness toward all sentient beings in order to have this kind of thought of compassion arise. And so all the way up until this moment, they have been, all of these sentient beings, ourselves included, subject to these various kinds of suffering and are creating the causes of their future suffering. And so just like me, who doesn't want to suffer and wants to have happiness, we want to then have this strong wish to free other sentient beings from their sufferings, just in the way that we want to be free from our own. And so whether we do this by, when we are on the cushion, engaged in a kind of single-pointed focus, wherein we are thinking about compassion and deliberately trying to generate that kind of compassion in a single-pointed way, or whether we are pursuing our ordinary activities, we should meditate on compassion at all times, focusing on all sentient beings and wishing that they all be free from suffering. So here, we shouldn't just sort of like meditate on compassion while we're on the cushion and then forget it all when we get up and are going throughout our daily life. But rather, we should have this recognition of the suffering nature of other sentient beings and a desire to free them from their suffering and a desire for them to have happiness throughout our daily activities. So really all four of the four immeasurables we should try to cultivate in our daily life of wanting others to have happiness and be free from their sufferings and abide in the state of equanimity and have this real true joy. And so really it's a matter of like recalling the kind of situation that sentient beings are in. I mean, normally we're sort of numb to this, but we need to have compassion in a way that pervades our ordinary everyday activities, whatever it is that we may be doing. So we need to really keep a recollection of the suffering nature, as well as this desire to free sentient beings from their suffering. And at the same time recognize that compassion, that attitude of compassion for other sentient beings is really the cause of our own future Buddhahood. And so hold that as something that is extremely precious and try to cultivate it in all times and situations.
Oh, yeah, so.
So, the time is up for today, so that will end our teaching for today.